thank you so much for coming to my lecture today on Beethoven's unfinished business. It's actually my unfinished business, I have to say. Last year I came in, I gave a lecture recital on 111 by Beethoven, and I played Opus 10 number 1, which is his first solo piano sonata that was published in C minor. And then I decided, well, I really ought to learn Pathétique at some point, because I have loved Pathétique since I was a very, very small child. And I have just never played it. I've taught it, but I've never played it. So I said, I'll play Pathétique. And I said that when I still hadn't played Pathétique, so about a month ago I picked it up, and here it is today. So we'll see how it goes today. I want to ask, how many of you have played Pathétique Sonata? Really, the whole thing or just first movement? Whole thing, great, excellent. Okay. How about Opus 10 number 1?
Is it the fifth sonata?
It is the fifth sonata, yes, exactly. Yes, that's a good point. In the United States, we generally refer to the sonatas by the opus number rather than Sonata 5 or Sonata 32 or whatever it might be. So interesting. Which do you think is harder, Pathétique or Opus 10 number 1? Those of you who have played, maybe both? You think Pathétique is harder?
Personally.
Yes? Anyone else have an opinion? I was surprised when I started to learn Pathétique Sonata first of all, it's not as hard as I thought it was going to be. When I was young, everybody said, oh, Pathétique Sonata, that's just so big. And actually it has this reputation throughout history of everyone saying, oh, now you're ready for Pathétique Sonata. But actually, it's not so hard. You do have to have a kind of strength and endurance for the tremolo in the left hand. But the rest is not so hard, I have to say. And we're going to talk about that as we go through. I want to get your impressions as we experience the pieces today. I'll play Opus 10 number 1, then we'll talk about it. I'll play Pathétique, then we'll talk about that as well, because I really want to get your ideas about why Beethoven would decide to publish Opus 10 number 1 in C minor, and then, which was written probably about 1795, 1796. And then a year and a half later, he writes Pathétique Sonata, again in C minor, a kind of very challenging key for the time, okay? Or let's say very passionate key. And we say that when we hear Beethoven in C minor, we see his face. It's his key, as it were. So, Opus 10, number 1. This sonata is the first published sonata that has 3 movements only. All his other sonatas have 4 movements up until that point. The 3 from Opus 2, and also Opus 7 has 4 movements because he's thinking about a symphonic structure. But he decides he's done that, he wants something different. And my question for you is, how different is this from earlier Beethoven or from Haydn and Mozart? Because Beethoven, when he's writing these sonatas, is 25, 26 years old. He's still thinking, I have to get published, I have to get my name out there. And the models, of course, that people are holding up as the quintessential classic composers, or the greatest composers of that time, are Haydn and Mozart. So as you listen to this sonata, what I'd like you to listen for is form, how he's using things harmonically, what sort of difficulties there might be for the listener. There was a review that came out of these sonatas after they were published in 1798, I think, which said Beethoven is a masterful composer, there's no question. But like all masterful composers, he has too many ideas. Okay? So in the piece, people are thinking that there's too much going on. I'd like you to think about that as you listen to the first movement. Can you keep track of where we are? Are we actually in the second theme? If we're not, what's the theme doing? Or what is the music doing that we're hearing at the moment? In the second movement, what is the form of the second movement? The third movement, what is the form of the third movement? Where are we in structure? So start listening as if, in a sense, you're in musicology class. What is going on in this sonata which makes it worth Beethoven publishing as a new sonata, Opus 10 number 1? But how could it be tied to Haydn and Mozart from what comes before? So, 3 movements. Allegro molto e con brio is the tempo marking for the first movement. Second movement is adagio molto. Third movement is prestissimo. what you hear. First movement sonata form, right? Okay. What makes that movement different from anything we've heard from Mozart or Haydn? Or does it remind you of any piece from Mozart or Haydn? Should I start the first movement again so you remember how it goes? This. Who does it sound like? I mean, it sounds like Beethoven, of course. But does it have anything that it reminds you of? Yes? Mozart C minor sonata, exactly. Which starts same kind of idea. And so forth. And Beethoven actually uses that progression to the diminished seventh. Does anybody know that piece? Sorry about my wrong voicings in the left hand, but that's the Opus 1 number 3 trio that he published in C minor as well. So one thing that I learned actually to my surprise when I became a faculty member, starting talking to my theory faculty members, was that in Beethoven's day, people weren't taught to be original necessarily. They were taught to steal from other people. Okay? And that's what Beethoven does. He hears Mozart, whom he went to Vienna to study with, although Mozart died and he had to end up studying with Haydn, but he went because he knew these pieces, or partly he knew those pieces, and that C minor sonata of Mozart captured the attention of so many people, Beethoven included, that people just started composing in that style with those harmonic progressions. Mozart himself took it from somebody. Does anybody know from what? Pardon me? What was it? I'm sorry, what was it?
Yeah, I was just joking.
No, that's Juno. Same harmonic progression for sure. Different feelings, but that's, you know, what composers would hear, and then they would steal and make it their own, as it were. What else do you hear in the first movement? Let's start with this. What did you like about the first movement of the Beethoven?
It has some sort of character, Beethoven-like.
Beethoven-like character. Did you see his face? You feel that you know who he is? No? Yes?
I think the rhythm moment, like I don't like this rhythm.
Yes, it is very, I mean, so it's one thing to be very gracious like Mozart is, like this, but to go, I mean, the same kind of thing with all that rhythm, is what they call a kind of Mannheim rocket that just goes to the top this way. That's really announcing something. And also, Mozart starts with a big sound, but Beethoven really gives full power to this. He wants the whole instrument behind it. Interesting. Did you find anything unusual about the first movement? Yes.
I didn't have the score for me, but I think it was the recap. It goes to like a D flat or C sharp.
Very good. It is D flat. And that becomes important. When you play Beethoven, if you don't remember anything else from this lecture, please remember this. When you play a piece by Beethoven, you must play all of Beethoven. Okay? And I'm constantly learning about things. I learned an astonishing fact about an hour and 20 minutes ago that I never knew my whole life. How many pieces did Beethoven write? 32? More than 32. For sure. Does anyone know? What do his opus numbers go to? Yes?
He published with Opus until Opus 136.
I think that's right. I can't remember. I think it's 136 is the last number. Very, very good. Okay. I learned an hour ago that he actually worked on 722 pieces in his life. But he's got 136 opus numbers. Okay. That he published other things simply without opus numbers. Sometimes he published a few songs. You know, the very famous, what is it, the variations, and so forth. That was published, but it doesn't have an opus number. Okay? So it's not, we can't simply follow the opus numbers and say, well, that's all that Beethoven wrote or considered worthy of publication. It's just that was his catalog that he was keeping for himself. Where did I get with that? Oh, so what I would like you to do is to remember that when you play a piece of Beethoven, we really have to strive to know all of Beethoven before and after that, because that D flat that this gentleman has brought up, which really is the change in the recap, which doesn't take us to D flat major, but takes us to G flat major, okay, which has no business in C minor. F minor either. Yeah, we get that in the Appassionato Sonata. But that comes later. That D flat plays a very big, important role in the introduction of 111. A little bit later in the sequential patterns. So Beethoven in 111 is revisiting old ideas that he got from composing in C minor much earlier in his life. It becomes a kind of compositional problem for him. And if we start looking at Opus 1, number 3, the C minor trio, Opus 10, number 1, Opus 13, which I'll play in a second, to the C minor concerto, to all of a sudden 111 at the end, there are certain similar problems that he is dealing with in different ways in all of those pieces. It becomes a kind of life journey for us, I think. Second movement, what's the form? Do you remember second movement? Yes?
Is it ternary form?
That's not a bad guess, but actually it's not ternary. I'll just cut to the chase. It's a binary form. You have basically a first theme, a second theme, which is based upon the first theme, a kind of 5/7 in the middle, which I tried to make a big thing of, and then you come back to the first material again. Okay? So it's very interesting that although it is a simple form, A and A prime, basically, with a little coda at the end, we get lost in it. Why? Because there are too many ideas. That's what the review said about Beethoven's work when they came out. There are too many ideas in this piece. I want you to remember that when you hear the second movement of the Pathétique Sonata. Does it have as many ideas? What's the form? How does it address this criticism that Beethoven got that he had too many ideas in a piece? How about the last movement? Any feelings about that? Remember, the tempo marking is prestissimo. Okay? How many pieces by Beethoven are marked prestissimo? Yeah, I didn't know very much either. Actually, I'm still not sure about that, except I know it's a very, very small number. Maybe 5 movements throughout his entire career. Prestissimo. Who does it sound like? Does it sound like Beethoven? No, when we think Beethoven, we think powerful but pretty slow. Or maybe something that is very grandiose. What is it like? Something like that is just open. But in this movement, does it sound like Beethoven to you? Who would you guess? Except that it's in C minor and it's very thick. I would say this is a Haydnesque movement. Okay? What's Haydn's relationship to Beethoven? Right, exactly. He was his teacher, and we say that actually Beethoven was a terrible student for Haydn until after they stopped working together. Then Beethoven really recognized what he learned from Haydn. They had sort of personal problems, in part because of money. I like this story, so I'll just tell it. Beethoven came to Vienna to study with Mozart. Mozart died, so he ended up studying with Haydn and Salieri and a few other teachers at the same time. And he was young. He was in his late teens or early 20s, and he was running out of money. So Haydn, being a good teacher, took it upon himself to write to his sponsor, who was the elector in Bonn, and said, Beethoven is running out of money. Would you mind giving him a little bit more? And by the way, he's written all these pieces, and he composed a list and sent it to the elector. And the elector wrote back and said, I've given Beethoven plenty of money. Secondly, most of the pieces on the list he had already composed when he was in Bonn, so I don't know what he's doing in Vienna at this point. Beethoven was not being very responsible, and it kind of created a rift between him and Haydn. But Beethoven learned a lot from Haydn in terms of character and in terms of form and structure, for sure. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at Haydn's piano sonatas, he wrote, 62 of them, although we know 52 of them. We say that they are by Haydn. You will see that his early sonatas, which are very easy, he wrote for students to learn. Then he starts writing for kind of aristocratic women who enjoy just playing the piano, and he makes them a little bit harder. But after he starts working with Beethoven, his sonatas become great. I'm thinking of the last 3 in particular, which he wrote for a very special pianist in London. All right, so we hear in Opus 10 number 1 that Beethoven is making his own mark, but he still has ties to who came before, Mozart and Haydn. Then he gets this review saying there are too many ideas, it's great music for sure, but we need something different, we need something a little bit simpler. Then we get the Pathétique Sonata. So many of you have played pathétique. How would you describe this music? Did you play it recently or when you were younger? How many people played it before you went to college? Yeah, that's right. So we always think that it's a kind of easy piece. And I remember the first time that I told my teacher, my college teacher, that I wanted to learn Opus 10 number 1, she turned to me and she said, "Oh, Christopher, that's really a kind of teaching piece. You don't want to play Opus 10 number 1. And I said, "But I really, really want to play it." I almost said that I wanted to play pathétique, but I knew that was a teaching piece, so I wasn't going to suggest that. But I think, no, actually I had to wait until I graduated from her before I learned 10 number 1. And it's a fabulous piece, absolutely. It's intellectually challenging and just very intricate in how it's put together. But pathétique is a different story. Pathétique is a word which means highly emotional, highly tragic in a sense. It is Beethoven's own term. There was a time when we thought that maybe it was the publisher who put that title on the piece, but actually it's Beethoven who did. He said this is a grand sonata pathétique. 3 movements, again, not the 4 movement symphonic structure that we've had before. But there is a kind of new thing in the first movement which this piece is famous for. What's that new thing? Yes? The opening grave, that's right, exactly. There is an introduction which we all know, and this is one of those chords which when everyone plays the chord, everybody says, "Oh, pathétique," right? So we know what piece that's going to be. Is it an introduction? Or is it integral to the structure of the piece? What do you think? All right, so that's a question for you to answer. I will tell you that I like to take the grave again when the repeat of the exposition comes. And I really like this idea. Serkin used to do it. There's a beautiful recording of Zimmermann playing it on YouTube with, he takes the opening grave once again. I think that it's quite powerful to do so. However, it stems from, that particular question stems from a problem with the first editions. Many of the original editions have a repeat sign going back to the beginning of the Allegro, and so forth. So you finish this kind of this chord, and then you start the Allegro again. However, there was a reprint of the first edition by a company called Hanslicker. I think they were the very first to publish the piece, which neglects to put those dots at the beginning of the Allegro. And so the implication is that you can go all the way back to the beginning of the piece, to the grave. I love that idea, because that grave material comes back at the beginning of the development, and also at the end, before the very last statement of the main theme of the Allegro. You'll hear it. So, I like to do it. I'll play it today and see what you think. Please feel free to say that was a terrible idea. I would like to know that as well, because I trust your musicianship, but I'd like to hear what you think. Second movement, oh, and I should say too, that you do have this grave, which starts out the first movement, but then it's marked Allegro molto e con brio. That seems to be Beethoven's marking for C minor. Allegro molto, very fast, and con brio, with life. Second movement is no longer adagio molto, it is adagio cantabile, so very singing. Listen for the form and the structure of the piece. Third movement is not a prestissimo, not a rondo, like was in Opus 10 number 1, but it's actually, excuse me, not in sonata form, it is a rondo. The third movement of the pathétique sonata is a rondo. Very clear, very simple in terms of its texture. 2 voices oftentimes, rather than thick, full chords. So, see what you think. So, we have 2 minutes. Why did Beethoven write that piece so soon after? Or let's say this, how is it different than Opus 10 number 1? So impressive in your mind. But it is very pathetique. It has much more direct feeling. In some ways it's more powerful, although I hope that you saw the ideas are fewer. The form of the second movement is actually a ternary form, but the ideas are very simply stated, and that's so beautiful. First thing comes back so often that it seems simple in a way, even though the form is more complicated than the form of Opus 10 number 1. The last movement is simpler to play, but it has much more power behind it, much more contrast of character, not just light and playful like the Haydn is. And the first movement, of course, is very tragic and very appealing to all of us when we're young. So, if you haven't played these pieces, please take a look at them because they are well worth your time for sure. Thank you for your attention.